listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Wednesday night, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. Find all the places where you can find this show. Places like Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, all of those places. There's links all over there at Odyssey Radio. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come and watch this show in its video broadcast. Sometimes it's exciting because I show lots of pictures and graphics and things like that. Sometimes it's just my mug yapping at you. But the best part of the video simulcast is definitely the live chat room, which is going on right now, filled with fellow Intrepids. You can find that over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, I gotta say, weather-wise, we don't give you a weather report here, but it's awfully nice right now up here in the Great White North. Wisconsin to the Minnesota area, we've got the 50-degree mark today. Into 52 and even 54 up on my front patio. It can surge all the way up to 60, and which is kind of nice. So it's been kind of nice here. It's going to be in the 40s for the next week, as opposed to the teens and the 20s and the 30s we've had the last few weeks. So that gives me a little more effervescent nature when I come to the show. I like a warm winter. I prefer a green Christmas. And the only reason we still live up here, because my wife has family here. Her whole family's up here. Me, I could live anywhere else. I could live in a warmer clime, definitely. I'm not a big fan of humidity, and so it's got to be, a perfect climate. What do you guys think? Put it over there in the chat room. What do you think is the area of the United States that has the perfect climate? I think in my mind, I kind of go to, I think of New Mexico. Not desert New Mexico, maybe the high mountains of New Mexico. You get a little snow, you get a little crisp and cold. I don't know, I think of California, but who the hell wants to live in California? Sorry, California. Sorry, Audrey. But I've thought the Pacific Northwest might be a fun place to live, a nice climate to live in. But does it get all humid and it's all rainy up there? And they say, it affects everybody's mood because of the constant rain up there, or the drizzle, or I don't know. What's the best part of the country? I thought Virginia was nice. I lived in Virginia for a while, but it gets awfully damn hot in Virginia, too. And can get humid there. North Carolina, my daughters live in Charlotte, North Carolina. They've been trying to coax us to move there for a couple of years, and it's like, I don't want to go to North Carolina. I could live there. It's better than here, I think, the ice and the snow. So what's going on in your neck of the woods? For those of you in the chat room, and if you got a better place to live, let me know what it is. Me, my dream, pull up stakes and move to a little island in the Irish Sea. Off the north coast of Scotland or something, or the west coast of Scotland. Go to the Isle of Arran or Skye or someplace like that. I would think it's got to be an interesting place to live. Then again, by this point in my life, I'd be the outsider the rest of my life. Maybe it's for those of you who watch the Outlander series, I'd be the Sassenach my whole life. We'll see. Let me take a sip of coffee. And we'll proceed. Tonight, because of a couple of things I saw in the chat room last night, and sorry, folks, by the way, I was fairly absent for the chat room. I'm going to tell you this. Last night was a pre-recorded show. And by pre-record, don't get so worked up about the pre-record. The pre-record is roughly a few hours ahead is when I record. And when I record a show, I don't record it like a week, like television shows. Every television show we pine for and we want to watch, it's all pre-recorded, folks. There's very, very few live TV shows that are out there. And same with this show. I pre-record it mostly because of technical reasons. And then I put it up and I broadcast it because I got to send it out to 2 different places. That's the technology that I've got to get on top of, that I kind of know in the back of my head what to do. I've got all the software and the equipment to do it. I just have to get my ass in gear and get it done to be able to broadcast live to both the network and stay on that tight time schedule, as well as posting live to the YouTube channel so you all can see it. And so I'll get that figured out. I got calls in already to the network guys to have them help me walk me through the right way to do that. And so we'll get that done. But when you hear a pre-recorded show like last night, that's pre-recorded because I pre-recorded it a couple of hours ahead of time and uploaded it. And I usually am sitting there 99.99% of the time. I'm in the chat room with along the recorded show. I'm there live with all of you in the chat room. And I wasn't last night because I fell asleep. I was tired. I fell asleep and I slept all the way through the show. I woke up at like 11 o'clock last night. I fell asleep at like 7 on the sofa. Nobody wakes me up. Dad, you got your radio show to do at 9 o'clock. You got the chat room to go sit in. And no, I didn't get woken up. And so I woke up all cramped up on the sofa at about 11 o'clock. Went, oh, crap. Missed the show. And I think I'll go to bed. Now, when I fall asleep at like 7 o'clock, because I sleep so little, I fall asleep at 7 o'clock. If that happens to me, I'm a 4 to 5 hour a night guy. Do the math. If I fall asleep at 7 and I sleep 5 hours, when do I wake up? Midnight. So I wake up at midnight, and it's like I've had 5 hours of sleep. What do I do now? I ended up getting up this morning at about 1 in the morning. 1:30 in the morning, I finally got back up again. And I'm like, I've been sleeping for 6 hours already. What do I do with that? And so I get up and I putz around. I do a couple of things that need doing. And then I sit down on the sofa and sometimes I fall back to sleep. And I fell back to sleep. And then I got up to drive my kids to school at 7. And so I've been up ever since. But that's the course that my days and nights seem to take. I would love nothing more, nothing better than to say, I have a set time. I'll go to bed at 11 o'clock. I wake up at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. So you get 6 or 7 hours of sleep. And you're good. But, comfortable bed. And every time I come up late at night, there's a kid in my spot. And we got a huge bed. It's like a parade field. And yet there's always a kid stretched out diagonally or sideways, so mom's over on her side of the bed, and there's a kid whose head is into mom's lower back and the feet coming all the way over, hanging off the edge of my bed. You got to pick up a kid and put him in their own bed, or you got to push him over, or depends on how awake you feel, or sometimes you just go back downstairs and lay down on the couch or sit on the couch. So that's the problem in my house, is kids infestation. Kid infestation. I say, do away with them all. Kill them all. That's a line from Star Wars. I don't really, just in case, I'm not really advocating killing children because they're sleeping in your bed. But anyway, when I came into the after hours, I looked back and I went through the show and I looked through the chat room from last night. And I saw a couple of people, there were some things mentioned, like somebody said, the show, I don't know if they were referring to the show or something else, but it says it feels like deja vu during this show. Now, I don't know if that means it sounds like what we talked about last week, because, and by the way, if it did sound like what we talked about last week, you're right. We were just continuing on something we had talked about last week, and I had to recap a little bit, and some of my recapping even overlapped pretty thickly with some of the things we talked about last week. There was a question, I think it was Maya, brought up the question about the Q source. Now, we had mentioned that. Now, we're not talking about Q in politics and all of that. We're talking about the Q source, which is the shortened version, the abbreviation for the German word Quell, which has to do with the word source. It means source. And it's the Q source on the life of Jesus, on the religion of Jesus, on who Jesus was, what he was all about. And, there's somebody who has written some books on this. Burton L. Mack wrote a book on this. And there was a time where, the Q source, it's kind of this search for the no-frills Jesus. Let's strip away. Remember we talked yesterday about Moses having written the Genesis account, but taken a lot of information out of the Enuma Elish, and he stripped away all the mythology and just gave you just the facts, man. This is what God did, and he didn't talk about sea monsters or anything like that. And this is kind of the search for that no-frills Jesus. And, the Q source, you would think it should bring an end to all the mythology, maybe even the history, the mentality of the Gospels. And by the way, when I say the Gospels, I'm talking about the 4 canonized Gospels of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as we have talked about on other occasions on this show and dug in very deeply, there are many who think that some of those Gospels drew from another Gospel, a source, the quell, the Q source. Yet that's a lost Gospel. And there's somebody that said, Burton Mack, by the way, has written lots of books about this. He wrote a book about the Q source. And he said, it'd be a great book, he says, but nobody would want to read it. And he said that back after he had published his own book on the Q source. And he was kind of drumming his palms and his fingers on the tabletop in his living room, and he was talking about the publication of a scholarly document that he believes radically undercuts Christianity's claim to be the religion of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, Mack, although he taught in seminary, he taught in biblical institutions, future ministers, this was something that still he pushed for. He said, I think, ministry is here, but I think we've got to have a better understanding of how the Gospels were written, a better understanding that maybe Jesus was this more no-frills, non-messianic type of character. And he blames Christianity, Mack does, for contributing to centuries of U.S. wrongdoing, from wars against the Native American culture to interventionism all around the world. And he declares that a lot of people are going to have to read this book, read this document, to get an accurate understanding of what the Q source document is all about. And since I saw a mention of this by Maya last night, that you're taking some, I don't know if you said you were in seminary or Bible college, you're taking some courses on this. And this might be worth looking at for a day or two to try to get our heads wrapped around what this is. Q is that designation for a gospel that no longer exists. But many think it must have existed at one time. In fact, even though no copy of this gospel has survived independently, so there are some 19th century scholars who found fragments of such an early Christian composition embedded in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Now, by putting these two Gospels side by side, you take Matthew and Luke and put them beside the Gospel of Mark. Now, you can go online or you can go to a bookstore and buy a comparative Bible, the comparative Gospels, where it lists them all in columns. And you can read these Gospels all side by side and see how they compare. You line these things all up, or at least Matthew and Luke. You take those two Gospels, line them up against Mark, and scholars realize that when Matthew and Luke are telling the story about Jesus, for the most part, they're both following the same order, and often even the same wording of the book of Mark. So it almost looks like they are all, like Matthew and Luke, which came later, are copying the book of Mark. But into this common narrative outline, Matthew and Luke, they each insert these extra sayings and extra teachings of Jesus. And although Matthew and Luke don't put these sayings in the same order, nevertheless they each repeat many of the same sayings, sometimes word for word. Now, does that tell you, is that divine inspiration? We were sitting and God told me to write this and I wrote it, and Matthew said, and then Luke said, God told me to write this and I wrote that, and they match because it's from God, or did they match because they both had a common source that they were drawing information from? Now, since for other reasons it seems unlikely that either Matthew or Luke could have copied from one another, how can this sort of agreement be explained? The answer appears to be that Matthew and Luke each had two sources in common. The Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel of those four that were written, and another gospel, now lost, or a collection of sayings known only as Q, the source, quell. And as we've mentioned before on this show many times, there are about 60 plus, maybe pushing 70 plus gospels out there that have been discovered that date back to within 100 to 200 to 300 years of the time of Christ. And that these Gospels, many of them, were topics beginning at the Council of Nicaea in 325 A.D. and going through some of the other ecumenical councils, or the church councils that were put together started by Emperor Constantine, popes of Rome, bishops, to decide what books should be included in or excluded from the biblical canon of Scripture. And it ended up, of course, with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the ones that were decided unanimously as being God-breathed. But what happened to the other 66 to 75 different Gospels that are out there? You can still find some of them. You can still read them. By the way, I was going to mention, too, that Mack, who wrote Burton L. Mack. You can look at it. He wrote The Lost Gospel, Q, and there's a subtitle to it. I'm pulling it up here on Amazon. The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins. And it says in the description, the first book to give the full account of the Lost Gospel of Jesus, Jesus' original followers, and revealing him to be a Jewish Socrates who is mythologized into the New Testament Christ. And we talked about this in great extent. Maya, I know you asked the question about the Q source. We've mentioned that a couple of times, and we did a series a long time ago, almost a year ago, or maybe it was earlier this year, on the Gnostic Jesus, the Gnostic mysteries, and Jesus as one of the mystery messiahs, the mystery religions. And we mentioned but never dug into the Q source, that there's sources out there, so that Jesus was mythologized into the New Testament. Now, there's other books, by the way, of Max that are worth looking into. This gives you an idea of what he wrote when he wrote about the book of Q. And he wrote The Lost Gospel, the book of Q and Christian Origins. He wrote Who Wrote the New Testament, The Making of Christian Myth. He also wrote Myth and the Christian Nation, A Social Theory of Religion. That's religion and culture. And he wrote Christian Mentality, The Entanglements of Power, Violence, and Fear. That's religion and culture again. And the tone of his books, I've written some of his work, but the tone of his books have lined up. If you go to Amazon, you get guys like Timothy Freak, who wrote The Jesus Mysteries and The Laughing Jesus and Jesus and the Lost Goddess. And you get books by Graham Hancock listed as recommended authors for you. If you're reading Burton Mack's work, read Graham Hancock and read Timothy Freak. And so those are some of the things that they've talked about in relation to all of this Q stuff. But as I mentioned, Q stands for quell, the German word for source. And although no actual copy of Q has ever been found, there's many scholars that are convinced that such a document once circulated in early Christian communities. Since it was difficult to get excited about something that didn't exist, Q remained a hypothesis. And it lingered on the edges of scholarly research. And I heard about it in my seminary days, but to no great extent because they didn't teach it. Because Q is kind of that non-religious gospel of Jesus. And so it remained out there, but it was degraded or relegated to the realm of hypothesis. In 1945, however, a chance discovery in Egypt provided surprisingly new evidence that rekindled this interest in the possible existence of Q. Now, there were two brothers who were looking for fertilizer at the base of the cliffs of the Egyptian region of Nag Hammadi. You've heard about the Nag Hammadi texts, where the Nile bends on its way from Chenobaskeya to Pabao. And as they searched, the brother called Muhammad Ali hit a hard, not the boxer, he hit a hard object concealed under the ground, and it proved to be a huge earthen jar closed with a shallow red dish. And at first Muhammad Ali was afraid to open the jar lest a jinn, which we've talked about, we spent a week and a half talking about the jinn, lest a jinn might be closed up inside of this jar. And finally he summoned the courage to break it, hoping that it might contain gold. And out tumbled not gold, but 12 books bound in gazelle leather. So they were bound books. And these books would prove to be one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. And one of the reasons for their importance is the valuable evidence they provide for the existence of the sayings collection known as Q, the Q source. And these manuscripts, now known as the Nag Hammadi Library, contained a complete manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas. A fragment of this gospel, written in Greek, had been found earlier at Oxenenko. Some of the names of these towns. Why can't they just call something, by easier names? Oxyrhynchos in Egypt. Oxyrhynchos. But it was only a fragment. And the text that was found at Nag Hammadi, although complete, was written in Coptic, which was the form of the Egyptian language in use during the later Roman imperial times. That's when they took hieroglyphics and kind of converted them more into what almost looks like cursive and Coptic text. And so on the basis of this text, scholars were able to reconstruct the Gospel of Thomas in Greek and the original language of its composition. And by this means, they were able to compare its contents with those of writings found in the New Testament. By the way, not Coptic, it was Diamotic or Demotic text is what was the conversion, the original conversion from hieroglyphic to what looked like cursive. So Coptic picks up on that. And so the Gospel of Thomas is this very different gospel from the Gospels that we have in the part of the New Testament, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It contains no narrative material, nor is there any story of the birth, the life, or the death of Jesus. It consists only of sayings of Jesus, 114 in all, and each preceded by the phrase, "And Jesus said," and the collected sayings of the Gospel of Thomas are designated by its author as the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke. Don't you think that would be a very interesting gospel to read? I do. And some of the sayings of the Gospel of Thomas are very much like those found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. For example, Jesus said, "Come to me, for my yoke is easy, and my mastery is gentle, and you will find repose." That's number 90. But others are puzzling. Jesus said, "Become passers-by." Saying number 42. What's that mean? So let's look at this a little more when we come back after this break. You all sit there, hang tight, and we'll dig a little bit more into what the Q source is, what it's about, and we'll carry on. So stay tuned.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, welcome back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And at the same time, come on over to my YouTube channel to watch the video simulcast and join the live chat room going on right now as you're listening to this. That's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Yes, I'm one of those pernicious YouTubers. When I talk politics and stuff on my social media, and I put up a post by anybody that's a YouTube host, oh, that's just a YouTuber. Well, what's wrong with being a YouTuber? I understand where they're coming from. During the pandemic, a million more people wanted to be radio broadcasters, and so they started their podcasts and they started their YouTube broadcasts. I am very proud to say I have been doing radio off and on since the year 2000. So I'm into this a good 20 years doing radio. Do you know I started doing radio? And by the way, if I didn't say it, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Go on over, subscribe, hit the little bell icon so you get notifications. And watch for the new platform to be releasing over on YouTube, which is a membership platform that gives you, for very small amounts of money, like a cup of coffee's worth, some great new content that's going to be exclusive only to members. Not the shows. Shows are for everybody. But there'll be extra content. Be announcing that soon. It's Wednesday. Hopefully by Friday we'll get that announced in its full glory. But I was going to say, when I started doing radio in 2000, I was doing radio from the St. Paul, Minnesota area via computer, and we were going, and it's not like it is now, but we were hooking up that way, and we were doing a show in Oklahoma City, a paranormal broadcast. And I did that for a while with a friend of mine, and then we did radio off and on together. We went from politics to paranormal to different topics throughout the years. Then I started doing radio for a small network, an internet network, back about, oh my goodness, it had to be 2008 or 2009, somewhere in there. And that spread into doing other things in other areas for other networks. And finally ended up here, doing this about a year and a half ago over on Odyssey Radio. So my podcast, my YouTube podcast, my radio show, I'm not part of the... I take pride, I guess, in saying I'm not part of the wave of people that during pandemic needed something fun to do, and so they started a podcast. That's not what I do. That was the same way when I launched Intrepid magazine. There weren't a lot of paranormal magazines out there, and I launched that in 2011. Then when it started becoming glutted with all kinds of people wanting to do the same kind of thing, I said, I'm out. I didn't just want to be one of the crowd. Did the same thing with our the Paradigm Symposium, our symposiums. I started doing the symposium and offering tickets, and people would fly in. That first year where we had the Paradigm Symposium, we had the whole cast of Ancient Aliens came in to be part of the show. We had Eric von Daniken, who wrote Chariots of the Gods back in the late 60s. It was his first American appearance in 12 years was at our symposium. We had all the luminaries from Ancient Aliens there. We had different authors. We had George Norrie, who does Coast to Coast Radio, came and was part of that show. We had Ian Punnett, who used to do the Coast to Coast weekends. He was a good friend of mine. He did radio up here in the Twin Cities on one of the big powerhouse talk stations. And he came and he did the banquet. He emceed the all speaker panel at the banquet. And so we had a big to-do. And then a couple of years later, we saw that there were people that were doing other paranormal. We had one big paranormal, it's still a big one, here in the state of Minnesota. And they started up the very next year, the same weekend as our paranormal event, as our paradigm event. And I thought that was kind of a, hey, let's go for it. Why, when we have, say, television, I've always wondered about this. Television, where you've got DVRs now, you can record anything you want. But it used to be that you'd watch a show on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. I loved this show, and I would watch it. And then you'd find another network comes up with a show that you want to really watch, and they put it on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock to be in competition with the other network. And I'm like, hey, we all like to watch these things. Why do you put on shows just to compete with each other? Compete for those ad dollars. Compete for those eyeballs. Compete for those Nielsen ratings. And so, now the advent, of course, of digital and DVRing and all of that stuff, that's all changed all of that. And that's what I felt was kind of going on with the magazine I started, with the symposium I started, and that everybody was in on it. And there's a finite number of places that people can drop their few extra bucks, or their lots of extra bucks. We had people that would come to the Paradigm Symposium. It would cost you, I don't remember the exact cost, like $350 for a 4-day ticket, all-inclusive ticket with a few extras, and they went down to, I think, $150 to $200 for the basic ticket. And then you'd have to pay for your hotel room. You'd have to pay for your transportation. If you were coming here from out of state, you'd have to pay for your own transportation. We had people flying in from Europe. Not just one or two people. We had many people flew in from Europe to that first Paradigm Symposium we had. And they bought those big tickets. And but then you'd have little paranormal events, different kinds of things that would pop up all over the country. For $25, we're not one of those big dumb guys that charge you $350 unnamed. We'll charge you $25. And these little things would pop up all over. And of course it would have, me and my neighbor Bill, we do ghost hunting, and we're going to do a little ghost hunting thing for you. And that's fine. It's perfectly fine. But they were trying to say that they were not being like us by charging $25. Well, they were not like us at all. And because we were offering a big show and a big event, and we ran it like a big show and a big event. And I know I'm cutting into time to talk about the Q source here, but I do want to say I started this with Micah Hanks. Micah Hanks, prolific author, a futurist thinker, a prolific radio guy. You can just look up Micah Hanks, and you'll find him. And I think he's at micahhanks.com, if I'm not mistaken. Or the Graylian Report was his show. But we started, he kind of said to me, we ought to throw some kind of event. This was in 2012, and so it's early 2011, saying we should have something for 2012, the end of the world. Let's have a big event. And so we started gearing up for that, and we came up with the Paradigm Symposium. And when it got down to, we ended up going October of 2012 was our first event. And we were getting all set up, and I said, what we need to do? I've been to many events. I said, where I see a lot of fumbling around, there are people fumbling, and it's time to get started, and everybody's looking at their watch, and nobody's on stage, or they're fumbling around trying to get the microphone to work. I said, I want all that out of the way. I want this to run like a show. And so, we had fanfare music start at, whatever time we started. It was 1 in the afternoon the first day. or something like that. And I said, boom, hit it. It's 1 p.m. sharp. Bam, bam, ba ba bam, ba-da-da, and the fanfare music goes. And Micah and I each have a handheld mic, and we go walking down 2 different aisles through the audience. We're saying, welcome, everybody. Welcome. It is the Paradigm Symposium 2012. Welcome to the very first Paradigm Symposium. And we quipped with each other, and it was back and forth, and it was witty, and it was sharp, and you had to be ready to roll. And whenever we took a break and the next speaker was supposed to start, bam, we start on time, and we start with witty repartee on the microphones. And we get people, and we did that for the 4 days. And it was exhausting, but it made for a fantastic Paradigm Symposium. And, of course, there's all kinds of... I can't say that we were copycatted. I think in maybe a couple of cases, somebody had the idea and then they just wanted to run over our time slot. And, happens in radio too. You see good radio shows where you're doing a live show. I was doing this show live. And I had friends of mine that were also doing radio shows. And then we had agreed on certain times to do shows. This was over a year and a half ago. And I found the other person would constantly step on my time slot. And I thought, why are you doing? I even wrote, he said, why are you doing that? Isn't there enough time out there? And so that's the kind of thing. That's the business side of this stuff that gets old and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I wasn't going anywhere with that. I was just relating a story. And I used up about 10 minutes of this segment. So let's move on. Let's get back into the Q source. You can all comment on that other radio show, magazine, event stuff if you want to. I got stories coming out the ass about doing that stuff. And I've always enjoyed doing that, but when it starts to become, I always said at the beginning, when it becomes not fun anymore, I'm not going to do it anymore. So there you go. All right, now we're talking about the Q source. Let's just move right back into it with a not-so-genteel segue. And we're talking about how ended talking about the Gospel of Thomas and these sayings from the Gospel of Thomas, how the Q source that they found this Gospel of Thomas bound in gazelle leather as a book in the Nag Hammadi findings. And we ended by talking about how some of the sayings of the Gospel of Thomas were a lot like those found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And so could this have been another one of those early sources from which Matthew and Luke based their Gospels? And according to some of the research that you would do out there and look at these books, according to some of the conclusions that were being drawn, salvation is achieved in the recognition of one's origin, the light, and one's destiny, that's the repose. And in order to return to his or her origin, the disciple has to separate from the world by stripping off the garments of flesh and passing by corruptible human existence. And this is all, of course, metaphoric. It's on a spiritual nature, that you strip off the flesh, as it were. When I was growing up in Bible school, and it's do away with the flesh and, think of the things of God. And for the New Testament scholars, one of the most interesting things about this gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, is that its author, who calls himself Didymus Judas Thomas, appears to have used sayings from the same collection used by Matthew and Luke. But for this author and his community, the meaning of these sayings was clearly very different than those of Matthew and Luke, who most likely copied what he had to say or used them as a source. When I say copied, it's like, ooh, I found this great thing, I'm going to plagiarize and write my own. And I think they used that as a source to write their Gospels. And the Gospel of Thomas provided this new, exciting evidence for the existence of an earlier collection of sayings used by a variety of Christian communities. In 1989, there was a team of researchers that was led by a guy named James M. Robinson of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity in Claremont, California. And Robinson and his team are accomplishing this by a highly detailed literary analysis of Matthew, Luke, and Thomas. And their painstaking work goes verse by verse, word by word, case ending by case ending. And after nearly 10 years of work, the results of their efforts are going to be published, or have been published, in the critical edition of Q. And the recovery of the Q gospel has stimulated a debate about the nature of early Christianity. And we talked about a lot of this. We were talking about the mystery Jesus. And one scholar, we've already mentioned, Burton Mack, has advanced this radical thesis in his book that at least some Christian communities did not see Jesus as the Messiah. Some Christian communities of Jesus' time and thereafter didn't see him as the Messiah or the Savior. They saw him as a teacher of wisdom, a man who tried to teach others how to live better. And for them, Jesus wasn't divine, but he was fully human. And this is what we talked about when we talked about the Jesus mysteries, the Gnostic mysteries. And these first followers of Jesus differed from other Christians, whose ritual and their practice was centered on the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And they didn't emerge as the winners of history, perhaps because maintaining the faith required the existence of a story that included not only the life of Jesus, but also the passion of Jesus, the death of Jesus. And so this is what Q is. It's the collection of the sayings of Jesus. And so there's this idea, it would seem at first glance as though Q were this thoroughly Christian text when you look at it. And it wasn't a threat to Christianity that, say, a Burton Mack describes. And so believing that something like Q might have existed doesn't in itself entail a rejection of Christianity. And there's a lot of scholars who are Christian believers that endorse the Q hypothesis. And so I think that is why, that's kind of the introductory stuff. That's why I want us to look at this. According to a largely North American cadre of Bible scholars that includes Burton Mack, who wrote his books, and in 1993 was when he published his own book containing his own Q rendition. And James M. Robinson is another guy. He was the founder of the International Q Project and a colleague of Mack's at Claremont in California. The teachings of Jesus in Q hold the key to understanding of Jesus that is fundamentally non-Christian. Can you have a view of Jesus of Nazareth that is a non-Christian view? Now, according to these scholars, the authors of Q did not view Jesus as the Christ, or the Anointed One, the promised Messiah, or as the Redeemer who had atoned for their sins by his crucifixion, or as the Son of God who rose from the dead. Instead, they say Q's authors esteemed Jesus as simply a roving sage who preached the life of possessionless wandering and full acceptance of one's fellow human beings, no matter how disreputable or marginal those teachings might have been. Disreputable is the word, not reputable. In that respect, they say that he was a Jesus for the America of the third millennium. A Jesus with little supernatural baggage, but much more respect for cultural diversity. Now, do you think, and let me ask your opinion, do you think that that view of who Jesus is a part of the evolution of mankind? That all these great, wonderful things, these mythologies in some cases, these great beliefs that were at their core were spiritual in nature and of the heart, do you think that those are things that we started stepping away from in the last 20 to 30 years? We really started this move away from that, and we had to secularize everything. I tend to be a little bit a part of that movement, unofficially, in that I want to look for some of the real reasons, the real foundations, the real stories that are beneath the hyper-spiritual stories that we've learned. And it's not saying that I'm never going out there and claiming that Jesus is not the Son of God, the Son of God, that he's not the Savior, that he's not the Redeemer, that he's not the kinsman Redeemer, that he's not the Messiah, that he's not the Anointed One. I'm here to say that I think Jesus is different than we may have viewed him. And many portions of biblical text are different than what we seem to get on the surface, the teachings. And so I think that is kind of the goal. Take it a little step further, and you've got this Q movement. It's that respect, they say, that Jesus was a Jesus for the 3rd century Americans in the West. Little supernatural baggage. And more respect for cultural diversity. What do you think of that statement? Or is that just the hullabaloo and the blah, blah, blah of a society that, or a culture that wants to get more, what would you call it? Just diverse in its cultural reach. So the thoroughly, are roughly 235 parallel verses in Luke and Matthew. There's 235 verses in those Gospels that compare to each other, almost identical, that scholars have identified as Q material. Their techniques and their reasoning will be, we're going to discuss that as we go on with this. They don't include the gospel narratives of Jesus' passion and resurrection, which seem to have come from other sources, written or oral. So all of these texts that seem to identify as being very much like the other, or almost the identical wording between Matthew and Luke, finding them in Mark, and maybe also finding them in this hypothesized Q source, all of those things, none of them deal with death and resurrection of Jesus. The spiritual hinge pin to the divinity of Christ, making Jesus Christ, is that he died to atone for our sins and went into descended into hell for 3 days and came up resurrected, offering that new life. He was the divine Savior. But none of that material is found in these overlapping Matthew, Luke, Mark, and Q source materials. Q partisans contend that the authors of Q knew nothing about the way Jesus died, or about the stories of even of an empty tomb, or if they knew, they didn't care. Hence, there was no atonement doctrine in Q theology. There is no Savior when they're talking about the sayings of Jesus in Q source material. And because belief in Jesus' resurrection is the core belief of Christianity, even very liberal Christians profess a faith in the Easter event, if only as a metaphor for renewal. And the people who wrote Q must have been adherents of Jesus in Palestine who were not Christians. And unless, as Robinson and others observe, one stretches the word to include anyone who admits Jesus or admires Jesus. And scholars used to refer to the members of the Q community as Jewish Christians, because they didn't accept the messianic status of Jesus. And it's a term which can sometimes lead to confusion. The preferred designation nowadays for the group which they were a part of is Jesus movement, as opposed to Jewish Christians. And it took decades, Q partisans believe, before the movement was subsumed into a cult of Christ, a largely Gentile, centered on the cross and resurrection cult that became known as Christianity. And by cult, it's like when I was talking about King David and him establishing the cult of Jehovah worship in Jerusalem. That was the cultic center. Not using that word as cult, in that negative, like the occult that people get so afraid of. Or a cult where you have to marry your sister and everybody else's brother and sister and blah, 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 and you live in a compound. Not that kind of cult. It's the cult of Jesus. And so Robinson and Mack are hardly the first scholars who tried to discern a non-Christian Jesus hidden inside the Christian Gospels. Ever since the Enlightenment, intellectuals and liberal clergymen have been on a quest for the historical Jesus. They want to find the historical guy. Don't just tell me the God stories. I want to know who he really was in life. And it's this, what comes into mind right away is having heard so many times in my past, that doesn't matter. You don't have to just believe. You have to put your faith in this. It's like, I don't want to just believe. I don't want to just put my faith in something. What if somebody told you there are real dragons out there that fly and they breathe fire and they need a Vestal Virgin to be sacrificed to them once a year? You don't have to go research to see if it really exists or existed. Just believe in the events. Believe in the stories that we're told. I don't want to do that. If I'm not going to do it with mythology, I'm certainly not going to do it with something that's a matter of faith. That's supposed to be a matter of the way I live my life. So I want to know who this Jesus was. And that's why there was a quest for a historical Jesus. Inspirational but purely human figure who might have intended something very different from the dogmatic theologies that were presented in our churches, and in the view of many, oppressive dogmas. Faith that grew up in the name of Jesus. And in the 19th century, liberal scholars looked to the Gospel of Mark for their clues to that historical Jesus. Mark is the shortest of the 4 canonical Gospels, and it contains few references to Jesus' divine status, and none to the virgin birth. Mark doesn't even talk about the virgin birth. And it's early, and it doesn't talk about Jesus claiming to be God in any place. In its earliest version, it apparently mentioned none of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances after his resurrection, merely relating a brief story of the empty tomb. Mark is essentially a collection of reports of events, accounts of Jesus' early ministry and of many of his miracles and his parables, and a passion narrative. And the various authors of the famous 19th century liberal lives of Jesus tended to follow Mark's outline, but eliminated or rationalized away the miracles in order to present Jesus as a preacher of moral and social progress who met a tragic end at the hands of the people who didn't understand him. And nowadays, though, Mark, the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, is out. The Passion story is too bloody for late 20th century sensibilities, and it also raises issues of anti-Semitism. And Q is in. So not only does Q, the source, contain no crucifixion account, with its emphasis on Jesus' sayings, it presents a purer distillation, if you will, of Jesus, of his moral and social teachings than does Mark's gospel. Mark does call Jesus a teacher, but reports few of his precepts that he put forward. Furthermore, those who claim to have found the real Jesus in Q believe that they have an important edge on their 19th century counterparts. Having carefully broken down the hypothetical Q text, that is again the parallel passages in Matthew and Luke, into layers that reflect the stages of its writing and rewriting over several decades during the 1st century AD, some scholars think they can reconstruct not only the document in its earliest form, but also the community that produced it, a cadre of itinerant Galilee ascetics. And these are wandering charismatics or wandering radicals, in the words of some source scholars. And they actually heard Jesus speak some of the words in Q, and who took seriously his command that they not worship mammon, because they're evil mammon. Because of their interest in this community, a favorite text amongst Q scholars is the so-called mission speech, in which Jesus instructed his disciples to not take food, knapsacks, money, or extra clothes with them on the road, but to depend solely on the hospitality of strangers. And why is the Q community deemed to have been a Galilean? Or to have been Galilean? Because Jesus did most of his preaching in Galilee. And Q mentions certain towns he visited near the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida, and their residents must likely remembered his sayings and tried to live by them. So what's more, Jerusalem, where the memory of Jesus' crucifixion would have been too potent to ignore, is some distance south of Galilee, hence the lack of a passion narrative in Q. And you know what? We're out of time for this show, and I got to stop there. We're going to pick this up and talk a little bit more about the Q source. And Maya, in the chat room, thank you again for bringing